There's this sort of golden rule in the digital age. It's practically tattooed on the forehead of every tech enthusiast, every startup founder, and data scientist you meet.
Oh, definitely.
It's the idea that more data equals better predictions.
Right, absolutely. It is the foundational assumption of the entire AI ecosystem. Feed the beast. The logic is just that the more information you pour into the model, the sharper, the smarter, and more accurate it becomes. It's just the law of large numbers.
Yeah. We just assume that if we collect enough dots, the machine will eventually connect them all perfectly and give us this high-definition picture of reality. But today, for our deep dive, we are looking at a set of sources that suggest something completely different. And honestly, it's a little unsettling.
It is deeply counterintuitive, to say the least. It completely flips that more is better narrative right on its head.
Specifically in the world of healthcare, it turns out that more data can actually mean more desperation. And the really tricky part here, the AI models we're building often can't tell the difference between a cold medical fact and a literal cry for help.
That is the core of it. We are diving into a really fascinating piece of research today titled The Algorithmic Echo of Human Desperation.
Even the title gives me chills. The Algorithmic Echo. I mean, it sounds like a sci-fi thriller, but it's actually a very real look at modern data science.
It's highly evocative, and what we're going to explore with you today is how human stress, fear, and specifically scarcity, how those things fundamentally alter the data we feed into machines. We aren't just talking about bad data here.
Right.
We are talking about data that is emotionally charged in ways the machine simply does not understand.
So our mission for this deep dive is pretty clear. We need to understand how, well, this source calls it desperation as input. We need to see how that risks creating healthcare systems that learn to recognize urgency rather than actual health. And crucially, what we can do to fix it. Because if we don't, we might just be building a massive house of cards.
And to really do that, we have to start by rethinking what data actually is. We tend to think of data as this cold, neutral thing, right? Just numbers on a spreadsheet. Heart rates, blood pressure, diagnostic codes.
Neutral data, that's the dream. Pure, objective truth.
Exactly. But this research argues that there is a massive difference between neutral data and what it calls vulnerable data.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Yeah.
Because I think most of you listening probably picture medical data generation happening in this very controlled environment. You picture a clean, sterile doctor's office, white coats, calm discussions.
Right. But think about the environment where healthcare data is actually generated for millions of people every single day. It is not usually in a pristine, sterile laboratory where everyone is calm and collected.
No, it's real life.
Yeah.
It's 3 a.m.
Yeah.
It's a crowded ER waiting room. It's a panic attack in a bathroom stall.
Exactly. It is generated by people who are in pain, people who are afraid, or perhaps most importantly, people who lack access to timely care. The context is an observation. The context is survival.
There's this quote in the source that really stopped me in my tracks. It says, symptoms are described not as observations, but as pleas.
That is such a profound distinction. When you are comfortable and safe and you know you have an appointment next Tuesday, you describe what you see. You say, I have a slight pain here. It started 2 days ago. You act as a reporter of your own body.
When you're desperate.
When you are desperate, you are pleading for attention. You aren't reporting anymore. You are campaigning.
So how does that change the actual data? If I'm pleading, does the data physically look different to the algorithm?
Drastically. The source talks about how medical histories get compressed or distorted by urgency. If you feel like you only have one shot to be heard, maybe you've been on hold for 3 hours or you finally got a chatbot to respond, you don't give a calm chronological list of symptoms.
You rush.
You rush. You highlight the worst parts immediately. You might skip the nuance entirely because you are terrified the system or the doctor will move on before you're finished. You strip away all the context just to get to the red alert.
But I have to ask, isn't that a lying, or at least exaggeration? If I tell the intake bot my pain is a 10 when it's really an 8, just because I want to be seen, isn't that just bad data?
The source is very careful to point out that this is not dishonesty. It calls it adaptive behavior under stress.
Adaptive behavior, so it's a survival mechanism.
Precisely. Think of it this way. If you are drowning in a rock ocean, you don't wave politely to the lifeguard. You splash, you scream, you flail. That splashing isn't a lie about your swimming ability. It's a signal of your distress.
That makes perfect sense. The splashing is the data point.
The problem is, while the human experience is full of this stress, the machine doesn't feel it.
Right, the AI is just sitting there on a server, cool as a cucumber, processing ones and zeros.
It is trained on the artifacts of stress, the splashed water, so to speak, without ever feeling the water itself. It sees the distortion, the caps lock, the rapid-fire typing, but it thinks that distortion is just the baseline data. It thinks that is exactly what the pathology looks like.
That brings us to this idea of scarcity, because the way we talk to a doctor or a machine changes completely depending on how hard it is to get an appointment in the first place. The source breaks this down into abundant access versus scarce access.
This is where we see a huge split in patient behavior based on access, and it fundamentally alters the data set we are working with.
So let's look at the abundant access scenario first. This is the lucky patient. Good insurance, maybe a family doctor on speed dial.
Yes. If you know you can see a doctor whenever you need to, you disclose things selectively, you wait for your appointment, you clarify your symptoms over time. If the doctor misunderstands you, you correct them in the next sentence or the next visit.
It's a conversation. It has breathing room. You can afford to be highly accurate because you know you'll be heard.
Exactly. But now, look at scarce access.
The breathing room is just gone.
Completely gone. Disclosure accelerates. And the source highlights a really fascinating and honestly somewhat tragic example of this involving chatbots.
So this was the real aha moment for me in the reading.
Yeah.
The study about suicidal ideation.
It is a striking finding. Studies show that there is a significantly higher disclosure of suicidal ideation and acute distress in chatbot interactions compared to in-person clinical settings.
Now, the optimist in me immediately wants to say, oh, that's because people trust the AI more. It's non-judgmental. It's easier to talk to a robot about hard things.
And that is the common narrative we hear in tech circles. We've created a safe space. But the source argues that is not the whole story. The crucial distinction here isn't necessarily that the AI is trusted more, it's that the AI is available.
Availability reshapes honesty.
That is the key phrase. If the chatbot is the only thing responding at 2 in the morning, or the only thing that doesn't require a 6-month waiting list, you pour your heart out to it.
It acts like a pressure valve.
Exactly. It's not necessarily a preference for the machine. It's the absence of human alternatives. But think about what that does to the data. The users are framing their narratives toward urgency. They are subconsciously or consciously thinking, I need to make sure I am heard right now.
So the chatbot collects all this incredibly intense, high-stakes data. And we take that data, which is completely saturated with desperation, and we train new models with it.
And this is where the machine's misinterpretation begins. We have to remember that AI treats inputs as direct, literal signals of internal states.
Signal versus noise.
Right. If you tell the AI, I am in level 10 pain, the AI records level 10 pain. It doesn't record. Patient is scared they won't get an appointment, so they are saying level 10 to ensure a callback.
The source lists these specific desperation behaviors. We talked about amplifying symptoms, but there's also collapsing timelines. I found that concept really interesting.
Yes. This happens constantly in triage. It's about making things seem more immediate, saying it hurts right now rather than it's been hurting off and on for weeks.
Because if you say it's been hurting for weeks, the system might just say, okay, schedule a routine appointment for next month.
Exactly. You learn to hack the triage system, and part of that is foregrounding worst-case scenarios.
Like saying, I think I'm having a heart attack instead of my chest feels a little tight.
From a human perspective, this is entirely understandable. You want to be safe, you want to trigger the system's help function, but from a machine perspective, this looks indistinguishable from massive, high-severity illness across the board.
A machine just sees the red flag. It doesn't see the fear of the person holding the flag.
And the system does exactly what it is designed to do. It escalates, it classifies, it prioritizes.
But it's doing it based on panic, not necessarily pathology.
It lacks the awareness to see the why behind the data. It sees the high severity language, but it entirely misses the context of scarcity that produced that language.
And this leads us to what the source calls the feedback loop nobody designed. This is where it gets systematic. It's not just one person panicking in an app. It's the whole system shifting its baseline.
It creates a severe compounding risk. The source outlines a 5-step cycle that shows exactly how this spirals out of control.
Let's walk through that for everyone. Step 1.
Step 1, scarcity limits human care. We start with a broken system where you simply cannot see a doctor. That's the baseline reality.
Step 2, people turn to AI.
Because it's available. Step 3, desperation intensifies disclosure. As we discussed, people get louder, faster, and more urgent to be heard by the machine.
Step 4, models interpret this as higher prevalence or severity.
The AI thinks, wow, everyone in this region is extremely sick right now. It sees a massive spike in level 10 reports. And finally, step 5. Systems adjust thresholds.
And that's the kicker. Desperation becomes normalized as baseline data.
This is the real danger zone. This isn't conventional algorithmic bias, like focusing on one demographic over another. This is contextual distortion. The baseline for what the system considers normal fundamentally shifts.
So let's play this out. What does that actually mean for you, the listener? If the system decides that desperation is the new normal, what happens if you're not desperate? What if you're just a stoic person?
That is the terrifying so what here. If the system expects distress, it reshapes its behavior. Calmer inputs get deprioritized.
So if I calmly type in my symptoms, the AI might think, oh, he's fine. He's not using any of the panic words.
Exactly. Nuanced narratives are completely lost. Care becomes reactive rather than interpretive. The AI learns to recognize urgency rather than health. If you aren't screaming, the system assumes you don't need help.
It's essentially training the patient to scream.
In a way, yes. It reinforces the very behavior that distorts the data in the first place. It's a closed loop.
Now, this is happening everywhere. But the source makes a very specific point, that this dynamic is intensified in the Global South. And I think it's important we don't just gloss over that as, oh, it's worse there. It's structurally different.
Yes, we absolutely have to look at this globally. In many parts of the Global South, or even deeply rural areas in the West, AI tools might not just be a convenient alternative. They might be the only accessible interface for healthcare. Period.
We're talking about places where clinicians are virtually unavailable, diagnostic tools are scarce. The phone in your pocket is literally the only doctor you are going to see this month.
And where follow-up is highly uncertain. In that context, the one-shot mentality is absolute. If you are interacting with a health app and you don't know if you'll ever get another chance to speak to a medical entity, you disclose everything at once.
There's no wait and see.
No, there are no second chances. So the AI inherits these collapsed timelines and absent baselines. It gets a flood of information all at once, totally stripped of long-term context.
To a data scientist sitting in a tech hub in Silicon Valley, looking at that incoming data feed, that probably looks amazing. They're probably thinking, look at how rich this data is. Look at all these details.
Precisely. They see rich data, but the reality is compressed reality. The source puts it beautifully. It says, we risk mistaking desperation for epidemiology.
That is a heavy line. We think we're tracking disease patterns, but we're actually tracking panic patterns.
And structural failure. We aren't mapping the virus. We are mapping the holes in the safety net.
So naturally, the question is, how do we fix this? Because we can't just stop using data. We need AI in healthcare. It has massive potential. But my first thought goes to consent forms. We sign those things all the time online. I agreed to let you use my data. Doesn't that cover it?
The source is very firm on this point. Consent does not correct this.
Why not? I mean, I signed the form. I opted in.
Because consent covers permission. It says, you are legally allowed to see my data. It does not govern contextual distortion.
Explain that distinction for us.
People might agree to let a company use their data, but they do not consent to their vulnerability being normalized. They don't consent to their urgency becoming a training signal for the next version of the AI.
And they certainly don't consent to the fact that their lack of alternatives is shaping how the system behaves for everyone else.
Exactly. Treating consent as a sufficient protection ignores how scarcity shapes the data before the consent form is ever even signed. By the time you click, I agree, you've already distorted your input because you're scared.
So this isn't a technical glitch. We can't just patch the code and move on.
No. The source explicitly calls it a systems design failure. It is a governance problem. We need to start asking questions that rarely appear in standard AI ethics frameworks.
Like what kind of questions?
Questions like, should data collected under access scarcity be weighted differently? Or, how do systems detect desperation-driven disclosure versus actual clinical severity?
Those seem like incredibly hard questions to answer from a coding perspective. But the source actually offers some concrete interventions. It's not all doom and gloom here.
No, there are real design solutions proposed. One of the main ones is context tagging.
Which is what exactly? Like adding a warning label to the file?
Essentially, yes. It's about labeling the data based on where and how it was collected. If data is collected during a localized crisis or in a region with severe doctor shortages, you tag it. You tell the model, this data was born in scarcity.
So the AI essentially knows, okay, take this input with a grain of salt.
Or at least interpret this with a different clinical lens. Don't treat this as the baseline for a relaxed, fully supported patient. Another proposed solution is disclosure velocity.
Velocity, like the speed of the interaction.
Yes, using the speed and intensity of the user's input to detect urgency. If someone is typing furiously, dumping information rapidly, using high-intensity language,
The system should actually notice that behavior.
it should flag that as a potential desperation behavior, not just raw medical facts. It's using the metadata of the interaction, how the user is behaving, to contextualize the text itself.
That's incredibly smart. It's giving the machine a tiny bit of emotional intelligence. It's telling the system, hey, this person is typing like they are terrified.
Correct. And then there are adaptive thresholds. This means dynamically accounting for scarcity conditions so that the system doesn't accidentally set the bar for sick and panicked.
And finally, human review.
The ultimate safeguard. Triggering human oversight when the data suggests systemic distress rather than just individual sickness.
It's about recognizing when the data is screaming about the broken system, not just the patient's illness.
Exactly. And these mechanisms don't reduce access. We aren't saying don't let people use the bot, but they prevent the distortion from becoming the new truth. They keep the map accurate.
It really feels like we're at a turning point with all of this. The source calls our current era the cognitive age.
And the key insight for the cognitive age is this. The challenge isn't just getting more data anymore. We have plenty of data. The challenge is knowing when data is shaped by need rather than truth.
Because if we build healthcare AI that can't tell the difference between desperation and a diagnosis,
Then we risk building massive intelligence networks on suffering rather than understanding.
and that is a really powerful distinction.
The source makes a crucial point right at the end here. These systems aren't immoral. They aren't evil robots trying to hurt us or ignore our pain.
They're just ungoverned.
They are ungoverned mirrors. They reflect the world exactly as it is presented to them.
But the world is presented to them through the lens of our own broken systems. The mirror just reflects the cracks in the wall.
Which is why, if we really want AI to support human judgment, we have to acknowledge that data carries fingerprints.
Emotional and structural fingerprints.
Yes, fingerprints of the very systems that generated it.
It is a lot to mull over. We usually think of AI as the ultimate solution to scarcity. Not enough doctors, just build an AI. But this research suggests that if we aren't careful, the AI just becomes an echo of the scarcity it was meant to solve.
Desperation is not noise. It's a signal. But as the source concludes, it isn't the truth either.
And governing that difference between the cry for help and the clinical reality, that is the real work ahead of us.
It really is one of the defining challenges of healthcare in this new era.
Well, that is certainly something to think about the next time you open a health app or read a headline about big data saving medicine. It's never just data, it's people.
Always.
And it leaves you wondering if these AI models eventually ingest so much desperation that they just become numb to it as the new baseline, will we eventually have to invent entirely new ways to express our pain just to get the machine's attention?
That's a chilling thought.
Thank you all for listening to this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.